The Pearl SUV sat in my driveway like I was merely a renter in the house my mother left me. My husband stepped out first, followed by the other woman. He looked at me, chillingly calm. "Go back inside," I refused. Watching her hand slip into his, I realized this was not a spontaneous affair. It was a staged performance. By staying outside that night, I did not ruin my anger. I ruined their entire plan. My name is Vivian Ortiz. I am 39 years old, and I spend my life looking for anomalies. As a compliance officer for the Crown Harbor Infrastructure Authority, my days are measured in discrepancies, missing receipts, and signatures that do not match. I find the lies people try to hide in the fine print. Today was no different. I had spent the last 14 hours buried in the physical archives at Morro Bay, hunting down a paper trail for a public works contract that someone had tried very hard to bury. My eyes burned. My back ached. I wanted nothing more than a hot shower and the quiet sanctuary of the house my mother left me. Instead, I found the anomaly parked right on my property. A pearl white SUV sat dead center in my driveway. It was angled aggressively, taking up the space where I usually parked my sedan, forcing me to idle by the curb. The engine of the SUV was still ticking, cooling down in the evening air. It was a blatant intrusion. This was my house. My mother had worked 2 jobs to pay off the mortgage on this beautiful, aging colonial, and the deed was in my name alone. My husband, Roman Hale, lived here, but he did not own it. He never had. I cut the engine of my car. The streetlights flickered on, casting long shadows across the manicured lawn. The front door of my house opened. Roman stepped out onto the porch. He was not wearing his usual worn-in khakis and half-unbuttoned work shirts. He wore a tailored charcoal suit, a crisp white shirt, and a dark silk tie. The silver watch on his wrist caught the porch light. He looked immaculate, polished, and ready for a high-end gala. Not a quiet Tuesday night at home with his wife. He stood on the top step, looking down at my parked car by the curb. He did not look surprised. He did not look guilty. Then, the passenger door of the Pearl SUV swung open. A woman stepped out. She smoothed the front of her emerald green silk dress, a garment that screamed expensive taste and deliberate intention. Her blonde hair was styled in perfect, cascading waves. She wore heavy gold jewelry that glinted under the street lamps. Her name, I would later learn, was Celeste Wynn. At that moment, she was just the stranger in my driveway. But she did not act like a stranger. Nor did she act like a mistress caught in the act. Usually, when a spouse is caught red-handed, there is panic. There is a frantic scramble to explain, a sudden rush of apologies, or at least a flicker of shame. There was none of that here. Celeste walked toward Roman with the measured, confident stride of a woman walking into her own living room. She reached the bottom of the porch steps. Roman walked down to meet her. Right there, under the harsh glare of the security light my mother had installed 20 years ago. Celeste slipped her hand into Roman's. He gripped her fingers tightly. I stepped out of my car. The evening air suddenly felt freezing. My heels clicked against the asphalt as I walked up the edge of the driveway. Stopping a few feet away from them, I looked at the intertwined hands, then up at my husband's face. "Roman," I said. My voice was completely flat. He looked at me. His expression was a mask of cold stone. There was no warmth, no history of our marriage in his eyes. There was only a terrifying, calculated distance. "Vivian," Roman said, his voice dropping into a chillingly calm register. "Go back inside." It was a command, not a plea, not a panicked deflection. He spoke to me as if I were a nuisance, an unruly dog that needed to be put out of sight. Celeste stood beside him, her chin tilted up slightly. She looked at me with a mixture of pity and defiance. She was waiting for me to break. I did not move. My mind, trained by years of corporate audits and fraud investigations, shifted into overdrive. I looked at Roman's perfect suit. I looked at Celeste's pristine dress. I looked at the way the SUV was parked, deliberately blocking my path, practically begging for a confrontation. This was not a mistake. This was not a careless moment of passion where two lovers lost track of time. This was a stage. They had timed this. They knew exactly when my shift at Marrow Bay ended. They knew the traffic patterns on Interstate 88. They knew exactly when I would pull up to the curb. They wanted me to see them. More importantly, they wanted a reaction. They wanted me to scream. They wanted me to throw my purse at them, to claw at Roman's expensive suit, to slap Celeste across her perfectly contoured face. They wanted the neighbors to open their blinds. They wanted a public, undeniable spectacle of the hysterical, unhinged wife. Why? Because an unhinged wife is a liability. An unhinged wife loses credibility. If I caused a scene, I would become the aggressor. I would hand them the narrative they desperately wanted. I refused to give them the ammunition. I took a slow, deep breath. I locked my eyes onto the license plate of the Pearl SUV. Bravo, Romeo, Tango, 7, 2, 9, 1. I repeated it in my head, burning the alphanumeric sequence into my memory. Then, I reached into the pocket of my coat and pulled out my phone. I kept my eyes fixed on Roman as I unlocked the screen. I did not dial a friend to cry. I did not call my mother's sister to vent. I tapped the contact icon for Lila Mercer, the most ruthless family law attorney in the county. The phone rang twice. Lila picked up. "Vivian," Lila answered, her tone professional. "It is late. Is everything all right?" I looked right into Roman's eyes. I saw a microsecond of confusion flash across his face. He had expected tears. He had expected rage. He had not expected me to make a business call. "I need to see you tomorrow morning," I said clearly, ensuring every syllable carried across the cold air between us. "Immediately. 9 o'clock, my office," Lila replied without hesitation. "I will be there." I hung up the phone and slid it back into my pocket. I looked at Celeste. I looked at Roman. I gave them nothing. No anger, no sorrow, no validation of their existence. I turned my back on them and walked past the Pearl SUV. I climbed the steps of the porch, unlocked my front door, stepped inside, and closed it firmly behind me. I turned the deadbolt. The heavy metal click echoed in the silent hallway. I stood in the foyer of my mother's house. The house smelled faintly of lemon polish and old wood. Everything was exactly where it belonged. The antique console table, the brass mirror, the woven rug. The quiet was absolute. I did not slide down the door and weep. I did not run to the kitchen and smash plates against the wall. I took off my coat and hung it on the rack. I took off my shoes and placed them neatly by the mat. I walked into the home office. I sat down at the heavy oak desk and opened my laptop. The screen flickered to life, casting a pale blue glow over my face. My hands rested on the keyboard. A cold, hard knot formed in my stomach, but it was not grief. It was adrenaline. It was the thrill of the hunt. My professional intuition, the same instinct that caught million-dollar embezzlements and elaborate corporate cover-ups, was screaming at me. The performance in the driveway was too deliberate. Roman's calm was too rehearsed. The presence of the woman was too bold. You do not stage a play like that just to end a marriage. You do it to start a war. You do it to build a narrative. If Roman wanted a narrative, he was going to need documentation. And if there was one thing I knew how to dismantle, it was a false paper trail. I pushed my personal feelings down into a dark, locked box inside my chest. There would be time for heartbreak later. Tonight was for data. I logged into our joint bank account. I needed to see what lay beneath the surface. The affair was just the distraction, the real crime. I knew with absolute certainty was hidden in the numbers. The house was entirely silent, save for the low hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen and the sharp, rhythmic clicking of my fingernails against the keyboard. The digital clock in the corner of my laptop screen read 11:45 at night. The adrenaline that had spiked out on the asphalt had settled into a cold, hyper-focused clarity. I was no longer a wife processing the collapse of her marriage. I was an auditor examining a contaminated ledger. I started with the most obvious surface level, which was our joint checking account. For the first hour, I simply scrolled through the transaction history of the past 12 months, my eyes scanning the familiar rhythm of our lives. Grocery bills, utility payments, the premium for our auto insurance, dry cleaning, dining out. To an untrained eye, the ledger looked perfectly healthy. There were no sudden, massive withdrawals. There were no luxury hotel charges in exotic zip codes or obvious jewelry store purchases. Roman was too smart for that. He ran a construction company. He understood cash flow and the art of burying costs. But I understood it better. I changed the search parameters. I stopped looking for anomalies in the expense categories and started looking at the vendors. I exported the entire year of banking data into a fresh spreadsheet and ran a pivot table. That was when the first thread unraveled. A company called Blue Juniper Development appeared in the vendor list. The first transaction was dated 7 months ago. A modest transfer for $850, categorized under home maintenance. 3 weeks later, there was another outgoing wire for $1,200, labeled as design consultation. Then, the rhythm accelerated. $2,000 for site prep materials, $3,500 for lumber procurement, $4,000 for specialized contractor fees. The transfers were meticulously sized. They were small enough individually to avoid triggering a fraud alert from the bank, and they were spaced out irregularly enough to look like the normal, chaotic expenses of a busy homeowner trying to update an aging property. I highlighted every single transaction associated with Blue Juniper Development. I did the mental math before the software even generated the sum. Over the course of 7 months, Roman had funneled exactly $32,490 out of our shared assets. This was not money spent on dinners or hotel rooms for a sudden, passionate affair. This was seed capital. This was a calculated, long-term, systematic bleed. I leaned back in the heavy oak chair, letting the harsh blue light of the monitor wash over my face. If Roman was creating a shell vendor to drain our cash, he was doing it for a specific reason. $32,000 was a lot of money. But it was not starting over money. It was not enough to fund a new life with a woman who wore emerald silk and heavy gold jewelry. There had to be a larger pool of capital. I opened a new tab and bypassed the joint accounts entirely. I logged directly into the primary portal for the regional bank that held my mother's original, now fully paid-off mortgage. I still kept a small savings account there to maintain the relationship. I navigated through the security prompts, answering the secondary verification questions. When the dashboard loaded, my breath caught in my throat. Right below my modest savings account, there was a new line item. It was an active home equity line of credit, a HELOC. The credit limit was staggeringly high, $250,000. The current drawn balance sat at $185,000. The collateral securing this massive debt was the very house I was sitting in, the house that was legally solely mine. My hands went completely numb. The cold, analytical shield I had wrapped around myself cracked for a fraction of a second. Letting in a rush of pure, icy terror, I clicked on the account details, my pulse hammering against my ribs. I pulled up the digitized origination documents. Page after page of legal jargon filled the screen, detailing interest rates, draw periods, and repayment terms. I scrolled to the final page of the master agreement. There, at the bottom of the digital document, was my signature. It was a perfect, cryptographic electronic signature, authenticated by a third-party DocuSign envelope. Next to it was Roman's signature, listed as a co-borrower. I stared at the timestamp next to my forged name. The document was executed on October 14th of the previous year at 2:15 in the afternoon. I closed my eyes. The memory of that exact day materialized with perfect clarity. October 14th was the day of the annual State Infrastructure Compliance Summit. I had been in a windowless conference room at a hotel in the capital city, nearly 200 miles away from this house. I had been sitting on a panel discussing municipal bond regulations from 8 in the morning until 5 in the evening. I had my badge scanned at every session. I was surrounded by 50 other state auditors. I did not log into a personal email. And I certainly did not electronically sign a $250,000 lien against my family home. Roman had forged it. He had hijacked my digital identity, likely intercepting the verification emails through our shared home network or a cloned device, and legally bound me to a massive debt. It was a clear-cut, undeniable felony. But a bank does not just hand over $185,000 without justification. A HELOC of that size, drawn down so quickly, required a stated purpose, usually massive home improvements. I dug deeper into the document portal, finding the attached addendums. Roman had submitted a comprehensive renovation proposal to the underwriters. I opened the PDF of the contractor invoices. They were all issued by Blue Juniper Development. According to the paperwork, my house currently possessed a massive, wraparound cedar deck in the backyard, complete with a built-in outdoor kitchen. The invoices detailed a fully automated, wrought iron security gate at the end of the driveway and high-end, drought-resistant landscaping covering the entire property. I turned my head and looked out the window of the home office. The backyard was illuminated by the pale moonlight. There was no cedar deck. There was only the old concrete patio with the hairline fracture running down the middle. There was no automated gate at the end of the driveway, just the open asphalt. The high-end landscaping was nothing but the same patchy grass my mother had complained about for decades. The renovations were phantoms. The company was a ghost. The money, however, was incredibly real. And it was gone. I needed to understand the timeline. I needed to know what the catalyst was for tonight's performance. I stood up, my legs feeling heavy, and walked out into the hallway. I picked up the family tablet that sat on the charging dock near the kitchen counter. We used it to sync our schedules, track utility bills, and manage grocery deliveries. I unlocked the screen and opened the shared calendar app. I switched the view from the monthly grid to the daily breakdown, scrolling back through the past few weeks, looking for anything out of the ordinary. I found it on the entry for today. It was a small, color-coded block, set for 6:30 in the evening, exactly the time I usually pulled into the driveway. I tapped the block to expand the details. There was no location set, no attendees invited. It was just a private note Roman had typed into the system, perhaps assuming I would never look closely enough to see it. The text read, Saturday-clear driveway, handle separation. I stared at those 6 words until the backlight of the tablet burned my retinas. Handle separation. The pieces snapped together with a violent, sickening force. The woman in the driveway, the emerald dress, the deliberate hand-holding under the security light, the aggressively parked SUV. None of it was about breaking my heart. All of it was about building a legal defense. If Roman had fraudulently leveraged my house for hundreds of thousands of dollars, he knew the paper trail would eventually be discovered. He needed a way out. He needed a chaotic, messy divorce to muddy the waters. In our state, the division of assets and debts relies heavily on the official date of separation. By staging that scene tonight, by forcing a confrontation, he was trying to establish a concrete, undeniable date where the marriage catastrophically ended. He wanted me to explode. He wanted me to kick him out. If I had thrown his clothes on the lawn, if I had packed a bag and fled to a hotel, I would have handed him the exact timeline he required. He would go to a judge and claim that the HELOC funds were spent on legitimate marital expenses before the separation. Or worse, he would use the chaos of a contested divorce to force the sale of the house, burying his fraud in the complex liquidation of our assets. He needed the date of separation to be today. He needed the narrative to be about a bitter wife and a new lover, completely distracting the court from the massive financial crime he had committed months prior. I set the tablet back down on the charging dock. The screen went black. I walked back into the home office and looked at the glowing spreadsheet. The $32,000, the forged signature, the phantom cedar deck. The meticulous calendar note. Roman thought he was playing a game of emotional warfare. He thought I was just a wife who would be blinded by the devastating sight of another woman. He forgot who he had married. He forgot that I spend my life dissecting the lies men tell on paper. I did not feel like crying anymore. The coldness inside me had solidified into something hard and unbreakable. I began taking screenshots of every single document, every IP address log, every forged invoice. I saved them to an encrypted external drive, building a fortress of evidence. Roman wanted a separation. I was going to give him an absolute execution. At exactly 9 o'clock the next morning, I walked into the mahogany-paneled reception area of Mercer and Associates. I had not slept a single minute, but the fatigue was completely overridden by a razor-sharp mechanical focus. I carried a heavy leather tote bag containing a neatly indexed binder of printed bank statements, IP address logs, high-resolution screenshots of the forged digital portal, and a certified copy of my mother's last will and testament. Lila Mercer was waiting for me in her corner office. She was a woman who spoke exclusively in actionable verbs and legal precedents. I sat across from her massive glass desk and handed over the binder. For 20 solid minutes, she flipped through the organized tabs in absolute silence, her eyes darting across the highlighted ledger entries and the fabricated contractor invoices. When she finally closed the binder, she folded her hands and looked directly at me. "Your mother left this property to you free and clear," Lila began, her voice tight with professional calculation. "Legally, it is your separate, premarital asset. However, in this state, the moment a spouse contributes communal funds or labor into the improvement of a separate asset, they begin to build a community interest. Roman knows this. If he actually built that phantom cedar deck or installed that gate using marital funds, he would be entitled to a percentage of the home's appreciated value. But he did not build them," I replied smoothly. "The invoices are fake. The vendor is a shell. Which is why the forged equity line is the real weapon here," Lila said, tapping the heavy binder. "He attached a massive, fraudulent debt to your title. If he defaults, the bank forecloses on your house, not him. The forgery makes this a criminal matter, but unwinding the financial knot in family court will be an absolute nightmare if we do not lock the perimeter immediately." Lila leaned forward, her expression turning incredibly stern. "Listen to me very carefully, Vivian. Under no circumstances are you to leave that house. Do not pack a bag. Do not go to a hotel to clear your head. Do not stay with a friend." I nodded, understanding the trap I had narrowly avoided the night before. "If you had stormed out after that ridiculous display in the driveway," Lila continued, validating my exact suspicions, "Roman would have filed a petition this morning citing a peaceful voluntary separation. He would claim you abandoned the marital home. He would use that physical separation to legitimize the timeline of his financial maneuvers. He needs you out so he can control the narrative and the property. You stay put. You occupy your space. Make him be the one to sleep in the guest room or leave." I left Lila's office with a strict, tactical checklist. My first stop was a quiet booth in a coffee shop across the street, where I opened my laptop and initiated a localized financial lockdown. I contacted the fraud department of the regional bank. I did not yell at the representative. I simply provided my social security number, stated that an electronic signature on a high-value loan document had been mathematically and geographically falsified, and demanded an immediate, temporary freeze on all future disbursements. I filed a formal dispute report and requested a hard copy of the IP logs for the document envelope. Next, I opened a premium title monitoring service, linking it directly to the property's parcel number. If Roman attempted to file a quitclaim deed or record any further liens, I would be notified within 60 seconds. I then called the county recorder's office and submitted an expedited public records request. I ordered certified copies of every single piece of paper filed against my address over the past 18 months. I needed the official, notarized trail, not just the digital portal versions. While waiting for the county clerk to process my request, I began cross-referencing the loan documents I had printed the night before. I stared at the notary public stamp at the bottom of the equity line agreement. The name was Arthur Vance. The name triggered a distant warning bell in the back of my mind. During the early years of our marriage, Roman's construction business had faced a series of ugly disputes with subcontractors over unpaid materials. I had helped him organize his defense files back then. I pulled up the state's public court registry and searched Arthur Vance. The results loaded instantly. Arthur Vance was not just a random bank employee. He was an independent notary who had been listed as a witness in 2 separate civil suits involving Roman's company 4 years ago. Roman had used his own compromised associate to rubber stamp the fraudulent mortgage documents. The conspiracy was incredibly sloppy, built on the arrogant assumption that I would never look past the shock of his infidelity. I drove home during my lunch hour. The Pearl SUV was gone. The house was empty. I bypassed the kitchen and went straight to the master bedroom closet. Hidden beneath a stack of heavy winter blankets was a small, fireproof combination safe. I spun the dial, entered the 6-digit code, and pulled open the heavy steel door. Inside, underneath our passports and birth certificates, was a thick manila envelope labeled in my mother's elegant cursive. I dumped the contents onto the bed. It was a treasure trove of historical baseline data. There were original contractor receipts from 15 years ago, paid in full invoices for the roof replacement, the foundation reinforcement, and the kitchen remodel. These yellowing pieces of paper were the ultimate shield. They proved, unequivocally, that the house was fully updated and possessed its current market value long before Roman Hale ever moved his clothes into the closet. He could not claim a single dollar of sweat equity or communal contribution, because my mother had already paid for it all. I gathered the fragile papers, placed them in a waterproof folder, and locked them back in the safe. I went back to work, finished my compliance audits for the state, and returned home at exactly 6:30 in the evening. I made myself a cup of tea and sat at the kitchen island. At 7:15, the front door unlocked. Roman walked in. He was back in his casual work clothes, holding a leather briefcase. He stopped in the hallway when he saw me sitting there. He looked exhausted, but he quickly arranged his features into an expression of patient, gentle concern. He was ready to play the role of the remorseful but misunderstood husband. He walked into the kitchen, setting his briefcase on the counter. "Vivian," he said softly, putting his hands in his pockets. "Look, last night was a mess. It got out of hand. I know you are hurt, and I know it looked terrible, but it is just an awkward misunderstanding. We need to sit down. We need to talk about logistics and figure out how we are going to handle this gracefully." He was trying to reset the board. He wanted to draw me into an emotional argument about the woman in the driveway, hoping I would negotiate my exit from the house. I took a slow sip of my tea. I looked at the man I had lived with for 7 years. I did not see a husband anymore. I saw a hostile counterparty. I set the mug down on the granite counter. The ceramic made a sharp, definitive clink in the quiet room. I looked directly into his eyes, giving him absolutely nothing. "All further conversations," I said, my voice completely devoid of emotion, "will be through lawyers." I picked up my tea, walked past him without brushing his shoulder, and headed down the hall, leaving him standing alone in the kitchen of a house he would never own. For the first 48 hours following the confrontation, I existed in a state of deliberate, calculating silence. I did not drive past the places Roman frequented. I did not try to hack into his personal phone while he was sleeping in the guest bedroom. I certainly did not try to find the woman from the driveway to throw a drink in her face or demand an explanation. The angry, betrayed wife is a predictable creature. She screams, she cries, she confronts the mistress, and in doing so, she reveals all her cards. I preferred to keep mine hidden in the dark. I needed to understand exactly who Celeste Wynne was. In the architecture of my husband's fraud, a mistress was a luxury he could not afford. Roman was entirely too practical to blow up his life, and potentially face federal wire fraud charges over a forged loan document, just for a casual romance. If she was standing in my driveway, anchoring his narrative, she had a specific function. On a quiet Thursday evening, while Roman was out at a supposed late-night job site, I poured myself a glass of ice water, returned to my home office, and began to pull back the curtain on the stage he had built. I bypassed the usual social media platforms at first. Instagram and Facebook only show the glossy, curated surface of a person's life, and I needed the structural foundation. I logged directly into the state's Department of Consumer Affairs portal, specifically targeting the Division of Real Estate Licensing. I typed her full name into the public registry search bar. The database returned a match instantly. Celeste Wynn was not a struggling artist or an office manager. She was a fully licensed real estate broker. Her license had been active for 6 years, and her registered brokerage was a boutique agency located right in the heart of Morro Bay, the exact district where I spent half my time conducting municipal compliance audits. I leaned closer to the monitor, the blue light reflecting in the dark window panes of my office. I cross-referenced her name with the county's public property appraisal records, running a wide net search for any transactions within a 10-mile radius of my home over the past 12 months. 4 pages of search results populated the screen. I scrolled past the commercial leases and downtown condos until a specific residential address caught my eye. 6 months ago, a restored craftsman house located just 3 streets over from my own property had been sold. I opened the digitized closing disclosure. The listing agent who had handled the sale, appraised the local market value, and processed the transfer of the deed was Celeste Wynn. The pieces of the puzzle shifted, locking together with a terrifying mechanical precision. The entire nature of the affair changed color right in front of my eyes. Celeste was not just a woman Roman was sleeping with. She was a localized, highly trained real estate professional who intimately understood the property values of my specific neighborhood. She knew exactly how to navigate complex title transfers, how to handle distressed assets, and most importantly, how to flip a property quickly. Roman had not just found a girlfriend, he had recruited a fence. If Roman successfully forced me out of the house using the emotional trauma of the affair, and if he managed to stall the discovery of the forged equity line through a chaotic, messy divorce proceeding, he would eventually need to liquidate the asset to cover his tracks and pay off his failing commercial projects. He could not sell the house himself without raising massive red flags. But a seasoned local broker, a woman who already knew the neighborhood comparables, could quietly list the property, push through a cash buyer, and execute the sale while the family court was still untangling the wreckage of our marriage. Celeste was the functional link. She was the mechanism by which my mother's house would be turned into untraceable liquid cash. Just as the sheer scale of their partnership settled over me, my phone vibrated against the wooden surface of the desk. It was a text message from Martha, an elderly widow who lived in the brick colonial directly across the street from me. Martha rarely texted, preferring to wave from her porch or leave handwritten notes in my mailbox. The message read, "Vivian dear, I am so sorry to bother you. I know things have been tense over there lately. I was reviewing my security camera footage because of some stolen packages on our block, and I noticed something I thought you should see. Please do not be angry with me for sending this." Below the text were 3 compressed video files attached from her doorbell camera system. My chest tightened. I clicked on the first video. The timestamp in the corner read Friday, October 28th, at 9:30 in the evening. The black and white infrared footage showed my driveway. My car was absent, as I had been working a late-night audit at the harbor. A vehicle pulled into my driveway. It was the distinct, bulky shape of the Pearl SUV. The passenger door opened, and a figure matching Celeste's silhouette walked casually up to my front door, followed by Roman. I opened the second video. The timestamp was Friday, November 11th, at 10:15 at night, the same SUV, the same routine. I opened the third video, Friday, December 2nd. I sat back in my chair, the silence of the house pressing against my eardrums. I had been so focused on the confrontation in the driveway that I had fundamentally misunderstood its purpose. I had assumed it was a reckless, arrogant debut. It was not. They had been using my driveway as a parking lot for months. They deliberately chose the Friday nights when Roman knew my compliance schedule kept me at the Morro Bay office until nearly midnight. They were not hiding. They were rehearsing. Roman had orchestrated the timing perfectly. He knew Martha had a security camera. He probably knew other neighbors had them too. By bringing Celeste to the house repeatedly when I was not there, he was establishing a documented visual pattern of a new domestic life. He was planting the seeds in the neighborhood's collective memory. Then, he orchestrated the grand finale, timing their arrival to perfectly intersect with my return from work, guaranteeing a confrontation on the front lawn. He wanted the neighbors to witness the explosion. He wanted the camera across the street to capture the exact moment our marriage supposedly fractured, validating the narrative he desperately needed for the judge. He needed visual proof that our union had been dead for a long time, replaced by this new woman, to justify whatever financial moves he was making in the background. He had turned my front yard into a film set. 2 days later, the final piece of evidence fell directly into my lap, delivered by the absolute arrogance of the other woman herself. I was sitting in my car in the parking garage of the Infrastructure Authority, letting the engine warm up before the drive home. My phone chimed with an incoming text message from an unknown number. I opened the notification. "Vivian," the message read, "this is Celeste. I think it is time we act like adults. Roman told me your marriage is just paperwork now and has been over for a year. You refusing to leave the house is just making it harder on yourself. Stop dragging this out of spite. Let him go." I stared at the glowing screen, a slow, cold smile spreading across my face for the first time in a week. People who think they are the smartest person in the room always talk too much. Celeste thought she was delivering a sophisticated, condescending blow to a defeated wife. She thought she was projecting power. Instead, she had just handed me a loaded gun. I took 3 separate screenshots of the message, ensuring the phone number and the exact time and date were clearly visible, and immediately uploaded them to the encrypted drive holding my legal files. The text message was a monumental tactical error on her part. In her attempt to assert dominance, Celeste had put it in writing that Roman had fed her a premeditated, unified story. "Your marriage is just paperwork now." That was not the language of a spontaneous, unexpected love affair. That was a script. By confirming that Roman had actively convinced her the marriage was functionally dead long before the driveway incident, she proved that the confrontation had not been a sudden breaking point. It proved premeditation. If Roman ever tried to stand up in a deposition and claim that the affair was a recent, impulsive mistake that ruined our happy home, I now had written testimony from his own co-conspirator, proving he had been laying the psychological groundwork for months. I locked my phone and put the car into drive. As I navigated out of the concrete garage and into the evening traffic, the heavy weight of betrayal that had been sitting on my chest finally evaporated, replaced entirely by a singular, focused, absolute resolve. Celeste Wynne was not just a mistress who had parked in my driveway. She was the exit strategy for a man who had stolen hundreds of thousands of dollars against my name. They thought I was a fragile obstacle they could simply intimidate into leaving. They had no idea they had just invited a seasoned auditor to review their entire lives. The house settled into a bizarre, suffocating rhythm. Every morning, I woke up at exactly 6 o'clock. I made coffee using the old French press, poured it into my insulated travel mug, and backed my car out of the driveway by 7:15. I went to work. I audited municipal records. I came home at 6:30 in the evening. I cooked dinner. I washed my dishes. I did not scream. I did not throw picture frames against the drywall. I did not pack a suitcase. Roman was slowly losing his mind. He had built an elaborate stage, cast the actors, and written the script for a dramatic, fiery divorce, but his leading lady absolutely refused to say her lines. My unwavering, glacial routine was starving him of the oxygen he needed for his legal narrative. He would hover in the kitchen doorway while I chopped vegetables, radiating a tense, nervous energy. He wanted me to explode so he could play the victim. Instead, I treated him with the polite, distant efficiency of a bank teller dealing with a mildly annoying customer. What he did not know was that my phone, sitting face down on the granite counter, was actively recording every single one of our interactions. In a one-party consent state, his frustrated sighs and passive-aggressive remarks about my supposed coldness were just another data point for Lila Mercer. While I maintained the illusion of a woman in deep denial, my real work happened during my lunch hours and evening commutes. I needed to pull the physical threads of his fake invoices, to see where the money was actually bleeding out. On a rainy Tuesday afternoon, I sat in the front seat of my sedan eating a stale turkey sandwich and scrolled through my phone contacts until I found the number for a local garage door technician named Hector. Roman had hired him 2 years ago to replace a broken tension spring on our attached garage. Hector was a straight shooter, the kind of blue-collar contractor who hated the administrative games general contractors often played. Hector picked up on the third ring over the loud hum of a commercial air compressor. I kept my voice entirely casual, explaining that I was updating our home insurance policy and needed to verify some recent exterior upgrades for the underwriter. I asked him directly about the fully automated, wrought iron security gate at the end of our driveway, reading off the exact specifications and the hefty price tag from the invoice Roman had submitted to the bank. Hector laughed. It was a rough, gravelly sound over the phone line. He told me he had never installed a gate like that on my property, or any property in that zip code for that matter. He said his company exclusively handled residential overhead doors. An automated wrought iron system of that caliber would cost upwards of $15,000, require specialized municipal permits, and involve pouring deep concrete footings. He confirmed what my eyes had already told me. The invoice was a complete and total fabrication, but Hector gave me something else. Construction is a remarkably small world in Morro Bay. It is a tight-knit ecosystem of subcontractors who gossip endlessly at the lumber yards and supply depots. Before hanging up, Hector casually mentioned that it was a real shame about Roman's current financial situation. I pressed him gently, keeping my tone sympathetic, asking what exactly he meant. Hector lowered his voice, the power tools whining in the background. He told me everyone in the trade knew Roman was bleeding out over a massive townhouse development on the eastern edge of the county. The project had been stalled for over 6 months due to severe zoning disputes, expired permits, and skyrocketing material costs. Plumbers and electricians were walking off the job site every single week because the payroll checks were bouncing. Roman was allegedly drowning in municipal penalties and desperate for massive amounts of liquidity to keep the bank from foreclosing on the commercial dirt. I ended the call and stared out the rain-streaked windshield of my car. The puzzle pieces locked together with a sickening, heavy crunch. The townhouse project was the black hole. Blue Juniper Development was not just a shell company designed to steal my equity, it was the funnel. Roman was draining the value of my mother's house, laundering the money through fake home improvements, and pumping the cash directly into his failing commercial site to keep his head above water. I was not just financing his mistress, I was blindly underwriting his impending corporate bankruptcy. The sheer scale of the betrayal required a long, deliberate runway. A plan this complex and legally perilous was not born overnight after a couple of drinks. That realization led me to my best friend, Tessa Rowland. I met Tessa for coffee on a gray Saturday morning at a crowded diner right off the interstate highway. I did not cry into my ceramic mug. I slid a thick manila folder across the sticky laminate table and laid out the financial facts in a low, methodical voice. Tessa listened, her eyes widening as the terrifying scope of the fraud washed over her. When I finished speaking, Tessa sat perfectly still, staring at her half-empty cup of dark roast, her face drained of color. She looked up at me and said she remembered something that had seemed entirely innocent at the time, but now felt like a physical blow to the stomach. It was during a backyard barbecue on the 4th of July, almost 8 months ago. This was well before the fraudulent loans were signed, well before the Pearl SUV started parking in my driveway on Friday nights. Tessa recalled standing near the propane grill with Roman while I was inside the house mixing drinks for our guests. Roman had casually asked her about the legalities of property ownership. He framed it as a hypothetical scenario about a buddy of his in the construction trade who was having marital issues. He specifically asked Tessa, who worked as a senior paralegal in a downtown corporate firm, how difficult it was to change a title after marriage. He wanted to know exactly what kind of paperwork or financial proof was needed to convince a judge that a house had become community property through actual, everyday use, rather than by a formal deed transfer. At the time, Tessa thought it was just idle, boring barbecue chatter about real estate law. Now, sitting in the noisy diner. We both realized it was early reconnaissance, 8 months ago. He was actively probing the legal defenses of my property almost a year before he executed the digital forgery. He was looking for a backdoor into my inheritance long before he brought Celeste Wynn onto the stage to play the homewrecker. The premeditation was absolute. It was cold, deeply calculated, and thoroughly malicious. I drove back to the house that afternoon with Tessa's testimony burning a hole in my mind. Roman was waiting in the living room. He paced back and forth across the woven rug, his carefully constructed patience completely fractured. He tried to corner me near the bottom of the wooden staircase, his voice rising, demanding to know what my master plan was. He demanded to know when I was going to pack my things and stop dragging this misery out for both of us. He tried to bait me, calling me stubborn and entirely unreasonable. I looked at him. I did not see the man I married 7 years ago. I saw a cornered animal wearing a tailored suit, desperate to escape a trap of his own making. I told him in a flat voice that I was not going anywhere. I told him the house was mine. The mortgage was paid in full by my mother long before she died, and he was welcome to leave his house keys on the granite counter whenever he felt ready to face reality. His jaw tightened so hard, I thought his teeth might crack. He stepped closer, opening his mouth to shout, perhaps to finally force the ugly physical confrontation he so desperately needed for his separation timeline. Before a single word could leave his mouth, my cell phone rang. It vibrated violently against my palm, shattering the heavy tension in the room. I looked down at the bright screen. The caller identification displayed the name Derek Sloan. Derek was Roman's senior business partner, the man who handled the logistics and heavy machinery for their joint construction firm. Derek and I had never been close. We exchanged polite nods at company holiday parties and shared awkward small talk, but we never spoke on the phone. For his name to appear on my screen at this exact moment meant the financial fire consuming Roman's professional life had finally breached the containment lines and was burning everything down. I stepped smoothly around Roman, completely ignoring his demanding stare, and walked into the kitchen. I slid the heavy glass patio door shut behind me, locking it with a sharp, definitive click. I answered the phone. I kept my voice perfectly level, offering a simple greeting. There was a heavy, loaded pause on the other end of the line. I could hear the distant sound of highway traffic and the rhythmic, heavy thumping of a diesel truck engine idling. Derek sounded incredibly exhausted, as if he had not slept in days and was running purely on adrenaline and panic. When he finally spoke, his words were blunt, carrying the immense weight of a man who had reached the absolute end of his rope and had nothing left to lose. I think you need to know your husband is using your house to cover a debt bigger than you think. I met Derek Sloan an hour later at a fluorescent-lit diner situated just off Interstate Exit 42. The place smelled heavily of stale fry oil, industrial bleach, and burnt black coffee. Derek was sitting alone in a corner booth, staring blankly into a chipped ceramic mug. He looked at least 10 years older than the last time I saw him at the company holiday party. His eyes were heavily bloodshot. His skin possessed a sickly gray pallor, and his hands exhibited a slight, continuous nervous tremor. I slid into the cracked vinyl booth across from him. He did not offer a polite greeting or engage in small talk. He simply reached into his worn canvas briefcase and slid a thick black leather-bound ledger across the scratched Formica table. He told me the Eastern County townhouse development was not just facing a temporary setback. It was a massive, unmitigated financial crater. They were behind on securing secondary municipal permits by over 8 months. The cost of raw lumber, poured concrete, and commercial steel had skyrocketed 30% over their initial baseline projections, and 3 major local subcontractors were currently drafting aggressive breach of contract lawsuits. The construction company was hemorrhaging cash at an unsustainable rate, and the commercial mezzanine lenders were actively preparing to seize the dirt and liquidate the unfinished framing. Derek leaned forward, his voice dropping to a harsh, desperate whisper over the clatter of silverware from the kitchen. He confessed that Roman had explicitly stopped him from filing for Chapter 11 corporate bankruptcy 2 months ago with a very specific, ironclad promise. Roman had guaranteed Derek an immediate massive injection of liquid capital to save the site. When Derek had desperately asked where the money was coming from, given their zeroed-out accounts, Roman had smiled confidently and stated he was finalizing a massive refinance on a legally clean family asset, my mother's house. I opened the black ledger. It was a raw, unfiltered accounting of their corporate despair. But nestled between the chaotic pages of unpaid concrete invoices and mounting legal penalties was a separate, meticulously printed spreadsheet. It was a categorical breakdown of the funds being funneled through Blue Juniper Development. I traced my index finger down the column. The money Roman had illegally siphoned from my forged equity line, the initial $32,000, followed by the massive structural draws he clearly planned to take once our separation was finalized, was entirely mapped out. The stolen funds were not going toward a lavish new romantic life. They were actively being used to pay desperate drywall crews, cover exorbitant municipal late fees, and float the crushing interest on their commercial bank loans. Then, my eyes hit the final line item on the spreadsheet. The breath completely left my lungs in a sharp, painful rush. It was a projected payout ledger for the upcoming third quarter. There, printed in stark black ink, was the name Celeste Wynn. Next to her name was a projected commission fee of exactly 6%. The administrative note beside the financial figure read, "Broker fee disbursement upon the successful liquidation and closing of the Hale residence property." The darkest secret of my marriage was never hidden in the marital bed. It was entirely contained within the balance sheet. Celeste was not a passionate lover swept up in a forbidden, dramatic romance. She was a contracted vendor. She was the designated real estate agent assigned to quietly sell my house out from under me the moment Roman successfully manipulated me into abandoning the property. He had promised her a massive, six-figure commission on a $750,000 home in exchange for playing the specific role of the homewrecker. The Pearl SUV parked aggressively in the driveway. The intertwined hands under the bright porch light, the condescending text messages about our marriage being over, it was all just a theatrical performance meant to accelerate the divorce timeline and legally force the sale of the asset. Roman had cold-bloodedly weaponized my expected grief to save his failing commercial empire. I did not panic. The cold, mechanical part of my brain, the exact part that hunted corporate anomalies for a living, took complete, overriding control of my nervous system. I took the ledger. I left Derek sitting in the diner with his cold coffee, got back into my sedan, and drove straight to Lila Mercer's office. It was nearing 10 o'clock at night, but Lila was waiting for me in her glass-walled conference room. I placed the ledger on the polished oak table and pointed directly to the commission projection. Lila's eyes narrowed into dangerous, predatory slits as she digested the sheer magnitude of the premeditated fraud. She did not waste a single second offering empty sympathies. By 8 o'clock the following morning, Lila was standing before a senior family court judge in an emergency ex parte hearing. Armed with the ledger, the forged digital signatures, and the fabricated construction invoices, she secured an immediate, ironclad injunction. The court order completely paralyzed the title of my home. It legally blocked Roman, Celeste, the regional bank, and any affiliated corporate entity from executing a sale, transferring ownership, or drawing a single additional dollar from the fraudulent equity line. Furthermore, Lila officially amended our divorce petition to include a massive claim for the reimbursement of dissipated marital assets, explicitly targeting Roman's remaining ownership shares in his construction firm. We cut off his financial oxygen supply completely. Roman felt the noose snap tight around his neck by noon. The bank notified him that the equity line was frozen under a strict judicial order, and his corporate accounts were flagged for suspicious activity. When I returned home that evening, the atmospheric dynamic in the house had violently shifted. Roman was waiting for me in the living room, but the arrogant, impatient man from the previous day had completely vanished. He had abandoned the aggressive victim narrative entirely. Instead, He had poured 2 glasses of expensive red wine, set them on the mahogany coffee table, and gestured for me to sit down on the sofa. His posture was relaxed, and his voice was smooth, soft, and terrifyingly reasonable. "Vivian," he said, using the gentle, persuasive tone he used to reserve for apologizing after minor arguments years ago. "Let us just sit down like adults. The lawyers are going to bleed both of us dry in court. We do not need to do this. I know you found the papers. I know you are incredibly angry about the loan." He did not apologize for the infidelity. He did not offer excuses for breaking his vows, because he knew that I already knew it was entirely fake. He bypassed the emotional betrayal completely and went straight to the negotiation table. "Here's the reality of the situation," Roman continued, leaning forward with an expression of earnest partnership. "The company is in a very tight spot, but the equity in this house can save it. If you drop the injunction and just finalize the signature on the remaining loan disbursements, I can finish the townhouse project. It will pay out massive dividends in 6 months. Once the cash comes in, I will split it with you evenly. We sell this house together, quietly. You take your half of the inflated profits, I take mine, and you can start your life over anywhere you want, completely financially secure." I sat rigidly on the edge of the sofa, ignoring the crystal glass of wine. I looked directly into my husband's eyes. I searched for a flicker of humanity, a shred of remorse for destroying 7 years of shared history. There was absolutely no shame. There was no guilt. There was only the calculated, pragmatic desperation of a businessman trying to salvage a terrible deal. He was actively asking the woman he had defrauded, manipulated, and humiliated to become his willing co-conspirator. He wanted me to legally ratify his felony forgery so he could avoid federal prison and corporate bankruptcy. At that exact moment, the final, lingering illusion of my marriage completely evaporated. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. The most dangerous person in the world is not a partner who loses their mind to sudden passion, or someone who throws a screaming, violent fit of rage. The most dangerous person is the one who can meticulously plan your absolute financial ruin, hire a woman to break your heart, and then sit across from you in your own living room, offering to split the stolen money with the absolute, chilling calmness of a corporate accountant balancing a spreadsheet. The regional bank did not waste a single second. Exactly 72 hours after Lila filed the emergency injunction in family court, a thick, overnight courier envelope was dropped onto my front porch. Inside was a formal, heavily legally worded notice from the bank's Central Fraud Investigation Division. They had completely frozen all remaining disbursements on the home equity line of credit. The letter explicitly demanded an in-person verification of my wet signature at their downtown corporate branch and formally requested the digital access history, the device identifiers, and the Internet Protocol logs from the third-party routing software used on the exact day the loan was originated. The bank was no longer just a passive lender. They were actively building their own criminal file. The noose was tightening with terrifying speed, but the financial strangulation did not stop at the bank level. The commercial construction industry operates entirely on surety bonds. If a general contractor cannot secure a performance bond, they cannot legally pull a municipal permit, bid on a public project, or even break ground on a private commercial site. By Wednesday afternoon, Lila forwarded me an urgent, confidential legal notice indicating that Roman's primary bonding agency had initiated a severe internal compliance review. The agency had been automatically notified by a monitoring service when the title of my property, which Roman had fraudulently listed as a secondary collateral asset to prop up his failing business, was flagged by the court order. His financial oxygen supply was being systematically cut off. He was bleeding out on all fronts. This mounting, crushing pressure began to fracture the fragile, calculated alliance between Roman and his accomplice. Celeste Wynn was a licensed real estate broker, which meant her entire livelihood depended on market liquidity, clean property titles, and swift transactions. A frozen, legally disputed asset was entirely useless to her. I discovered the massive crack in their partnership late Thursday evening. I was sitting quietly at the kitchen island, meticulously reviewing my own corporate audit logs, when Roman stormed through the heavy oak front door. He completely ignored my presence in the kitchen. His face was flushed, his tie was pulled loose, and a visible sheen of nervous sweat coated his forehead. He paced the entire length of the living room with his cell phone pressed violently against his ear. His voice was a harsh, venomous hiss, kept low but echoing clearly in the quiet house. I did not need to press a recording device against the drywall to understand the context of his panic. Celeste was entirely losing her nerve. The grand, arrogant illusion of their shared financial future had evaporated into thin air the exact moment the judge signed the restraining order. She had finally bypassed Roman's smooth reassurances, checked the county registry herself, and realized the catastrophic, undeniable truth. Roman had never possessed a single ounce of legal control over my house. He had sold her an elaborate fantasy of a quick, highly profitable real estate flip. And now, her professional broker's license was dangerously close to being irreparably entangled in a federal wire fraud and forgery investigation. Roman barked desperately into the receiver, ordering her to calm down, demanding she stick to the timeline, and promising he would fix the paperwork. But the sharp, raw desperation in his tone was undeniable. He was losing control of his most crucial asset, and the woman he had hired to play my replacement was realizing she was about to go down with his sinking ship. Then came the fatal, decapitating blow, delivered from the absolute last direction Roman would have ever expected. On Friday morning, my phone vibrated with a text message from a number I rarely saw on my screen. The sender asked to meet at a quiet, secluded botanical garden located near the city center during my lunch hour. The sender identified herself as Audrey Hale, Roman's older sister. Audrey and I had always maintained a polite, somewhat distant relationship. We exchanged pleasantries at Thanksgiving and sent each other modest birthday gifts, but we were never confidants. However, Audrey worked as a senior paralegal and records assistant for an incredibly aggressive estate planning and probate firm downtown. She spent her days managing inherited wealth, contesting wills, and organizing trusts. She understood the lethal, unforgiving permanence of a paper trail better than anyone else in the entire Hale family. I met her on a weathered wooden bench situated under a massive canopy of old oak trees. The autumn air was sharp and biting. Audrey looked profoundly exhausted. She wore a heavy beige trench coat and held a single, crisp manila folder tightly in her lap. She did not bother with pleasantries or small talk. She sat down, took a deep breath, opened the folder, and handed me a single piece of printed paper. Audrey looked me dead in the eye. She said her voice was shaking slightly, but her words were absolute. She told me she could not stand by and watch her own brother steal a dead woman's legacy to cover up his own catastrophic business failures. I looked down at the paper. It was a printed email, carrying a timestamp from exactly 14 months ago. It was a direct message from Roman to Audrey, asking for off-the-record, hypothetical legal advice regarding property division and marital assets. In the second paragraph, Roman had typed the exact words that would officially, permanently bury him. The sentence read, "The house is solely in her name. If I cannot swing the paperwork to blur the lines of the community property and force a joint claim, I will not be able to touch a single dime of that equity." It was the ultimate, indestructible smoking gun. In a standard family court proceeding, Roman's only viable legal defense to avoid pure fraud charges would have been a desperate claim of good faith. He would have stood before a judge, looked incredibly sincere, and lied under oath, claiming he genuinely believed the house had automatically become a joint marital asset through our years of marriage and shared living expenses. This single, quiet email, preserved and delivered by his own flesh and blood, completely annihilated that defense. It proved absolute, malicious, and entirely conscious premeditation. He knew exactly who owned the house, and he knew exactly what he was stealing. Recognizing that his complex financial manipulation and his fabricated romantic narrative were both collapsing simultaneously, Roman panicked and violently pivoted to his final, most pathetic strategy. He attempted to completely destroy my character, If he could not be the tragic victim of a broken, unfair financial system, he would play the victim of an emotionally barren, abusive marriage. He launched a frantic, chaotic smear campaign. He began calling our mutual friends, his remaining business associates, and even attempted to plant the false narrative directly into Lila's office through his own frantic defense attorney. His new, desperate story was that I was a cold, frigid, emotionless workaholic. He claimed I was a ghost in my own home, completely and entirely obsessed with my compliance career, leaving him severely neglected and emotionally starved for years. He painted a picture of himself as a lonely, desperate man who had simply sought warmth and affection elsewhere because his cruel wife had abandoned the marriage in every conceivable way except physically moving out of the building. But a narrative built entirely on psychological manipulation and emotional lies requires a distinct lack of hard, objective data to survive. Unfortunately for my husband, analyzing hard data was my entire life's work. I did not need to scream at him, argue with his friends, or defensively prove my warmth as a wife. I simply handed my attorney a secondary binder. This binder contained my certified corporate time logs, my annual performance reviews for the past 5 years, and the downloaded tracking data from my municipal transit pass. My meticulous records proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that I maintained a strict, highly stable 40-hour work week. I was home every single evening by 6:30. I cooked the meals. I managed the household utilities. I handled our shared life with absolute consistency. My performance reviews highlighted my stability and reliability. Simultaneously, those exact same time logs proved that Roman was the one creating massive, unexplained, and erratic gaps in his daily schedule. The timestamps highlighted how he was constantly disappearing on Friday nights and vanishing for entire weekends to meticulously construct his fraudulent shadow life with Celeste and his failing commercial projects. The harder Roman tried to paint me as an absent, neglectful villain who forced him into the arms of another woman, the more his own chaotic, completely undocumented timeline exposed him as a chronic, manipulative liar. He was flailing wildly in the dark, throwing desperate, emotional punches at a massive wall of indestructible, time-stamped evidence, completely unaware that his every frantic move only pulled the steel trap tighter around his own neck. The mediation took place on a Tuesday morning inside a sterile, glass-walled conference room on the 40th floor of a downtown high-rise. The air conditioning hummed from the overhead vents, a low and steady drone that felt perfectly matched to the icy manufactured atmosphere of the space. The mediator, a retired family court judge named Harrison, sat at the head of the long mahogany table, flanked by stacks of blank legal pads. I sat on the left side of the polished wood with Lila Mercer. My husband sat directly across from me on the right, accompanied by his aggressive, high-priced defense attorney. The mistress was entirely absent. Celeste Wynne had vanished from the surface of the earth, completely removed from the polished narrative Roman was currently trying to spin. He was back to playing the role of the reasonable, exhausted executive. He wore a tailored navy suit, his silk tie perfectly knotted, his posture projecting the weary resignation of a man who just wanted to settle a tragic, unfortunate misunderstanding. For the first 45 minutes of the session, I barely spoke a single word. I sat perfectly still, my hands folded neatly in my lap, allowing Roman to control the oxygen in the room. He launched into a meticulously rehearsed, deeply emotional monologue about the tragic, slow death of our marriage. He spoke with a quiet, sorrowful cadence, using therapeutic phrases like mutual emotional withdrawal, communication breakdowns, and irreconcilable trajectories. He painted a vivid picture of two good people who had simply lost their way, making unfortunate, painful decisions out of profound loneliness and a desperate need for connection. It was a masterful, sickening performance. He was actively trying to frame his massive financial fraud as a messy, emotional byproduct of a failed romance. He wanted the mediator to see him not as a criminal, but as a flawed human being who made a mistake of the heart. Then, he slid a thick, professionally bound proposal across the mahogany table. His attorney cleared his throat and outlined the financial offer. Roman was prepared to be incredibly generous. The lawyer claimed, "If I simply agreed to drop the emergency injunction and sign the final disbursement papers for the home equity line of credit, allowing him to save his commercial construction project, he would personally guarantee me a lump sum payment of $75,000 in clean, untraceable cash. In exchange, I only needed to pack my personal belongings, vacate the property within 30 days, and agree to an uncontested, no-fault divorce." He pitched it to the mediator as a clean, efficient break, a civilized way to spare us both the brutal, humiliating exposure of a prolonged public trial. I looked at the glossy proposal resting on the table. I looked up at Roman. He offered me a tight, sympathetic smile, completely convinced that he was successfully leading the narrative. He believed I was just a tired, broken, humiliated woman who would eagerly take the cash payout just to escape the agonizing pain of his infidelity. I turned my head slightly and gave Lila a barely perceptible nod. Lila did not raise her voice. She did not express any moral outrage, nor did she accuse him of lying. She simply reached into her structured leather briefcase and pulled out a single, thin manila folder. The quiet rustle of the paper seemed deafening in the still, tense room. "Before my client considers any settlement regarding the marital property," Lila said, her tone as dry and clinical as crushed bone, "we need to clarify the legal origination of the debt currently attached to the title." She extracted a pristine copy of the digital loan agreement and slid it to the exact center of the table. She tapped her manicured index finger precisely on the electronic signature block at the bottom of the final page. "Mr. Hale," Lila continued, staring directly at Roman without blinking. "This specific document legally binds my client to a $250,000 liability. It was electronically executed on October 14th at exactly 2:15 in the afternoon. The digital certificate provided by the bank indicates the signature was authorized and authenticated from the primary Internet Protocol address registered to your shared home Internet router." Roman's sympathetic smile remained frozen in place, but I saw the muscles in his jaw tighten involuntarily. "Like I said," he replied smoothly, waving a dismissive hand, "we were handling the household finances together before things fell apart completely. Vivian knew all about the property renovations. We did the paperwork at the kitchen island." Lila did not argue. She did not raise an objection. She simply pulled out the second piece of evidence. It was a printed spreadsheet bearing the official, watermarked seal of the Crown Harbor Infrastructure Authority. "This is my client's internal security badge and time card data for the exact date of October 14th, Lila stated, pushing the paper toward the retired judge. "As you can clearly see, Vivian swiped into the subterranean parking garage of the State Capitol building at 7:45 in the morning. She badged into a secure, windowless municipal hearing room at exactly 8:30. She did not badge out of that secure perimeter until 5:15 in the evening. The Capitol building is roughly 90 miles away from the home router where this loan document was allegedly signed." The silence in the conference room suddenly became absolute and suffocating. The mediator picked up the badge logs, his brow furrowing deeply as he compared the unyielding timestamps. Roman's defense attorney shifted uncomfortably in his expensive leather chair. Suddenly realizing his client had withheld catastrophic, case-destroying information from his own legal counsel, Roman lost his rhythm completely. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. The smooth, rehearsed, sorrowful cadence vanished into thin air. He tried to quickly pivot, stammering something incoherent about remote desktop applications or the possibility of me using a proxy server from my mobile phone. It was a pathetic, scrambling defense, completely devoid of his earlier arrogant confidence. He could not explain the geographical impossibility because there was no rational explanation. He had forged the signature while I was physically locked inside a state audit, and the mathematical reality was entirely undeniable. Before Roman could even finish his fragmented, panicked excuse, Lila delivered the second, much deeper strike. "Furthermore," Lila said, cutting him off with surgical, ruthless precision, "my client outright rejects the premise that this residential property is subject to communal division. and we officially reject the assertion that your client ever held a good faith belief otherwise." She placed the printed email from Audrey Hale onto the mahogany table, positioning it right next to the forged loan document. "This is an electronic correspondence sent directly from your client to his own sister, dated exactly 14 months ago," Lila explained to the mediator, though her eyes never left Roman's face. "In it, Mr. Hale explicitly acknowledges that the property is solely in Vivian's name. He states, in his exact written words, that unless he can manipulate the paperwork to blur the lines of community property, he will not be able to touch a single dime of the equity." I watched the blood drain entirely from my husband's face. His tan, healthy complexion turned the sickly color of wet ash. He stared down at the printed email, recognizing his own fatal words staring back at him. The betrayal by his own sister was the one variable he had never calculated into his grand equation. His primary legal defense against the fraud charges, the supposed honest misunderstanding of complex marital asset laws, was instantly incinerated right there on the table. The final, devastating blow arrived not from my lawyer, but from the bank's legal representative, who was dialed into the conference room via a secure telephone speaker in the center of the table. Having listened quietly to the presentation of the physical evidence, the bank's counsel formally interjected. The voice coming through the speaker was sharp, corporate, and completely unforgiving. They announced that based on the undeniable, documented proof of a forged origination signature combined with explicit, written premeditation, the bank was permanently terminating all settlement negotiations immediately. They formally notified the mediator that they were officially freezing the deed indefinitely and transferring the entire file to their internal fraud investigation division for an immediate, aggressive criminal referral. The mediation collapsed instantly. There was absolutely nothing left to negotiate. The retired judge closed his heavy leather binder, signaling the abrupt end of the session. Roman's attorney frantically began stuffing loose papers into his briefcase, refusing to even look at his own client. As we stood up from the heavy chairs to leave the room, I looked at Roman one last time. He was completely ruined on paper. His commercial business was collapsing. His massive financial fraud was fully exposed to his creditors, and he was staring directly down the barrel of a federal criminal investigation. Yet, beneath the profound shock and the pale terror written across his face, I could see a tiny, desperate flicker of stubborn delusion clinging to his eyes. He still firmly believed he had one final, emotional card to play. He still believed in the immense power of the dramatic spectacle he had created in front of my house. In his twisted, cornered mind, he thought that as long as the driveway confrontation remained uncontested, he could still convince a sympathetic criminal jury that I was a vindictive, scorned wife trying to frame him out of pure, hysterical jealousy. He firmly believed that Celeste Wynne would remain entirely loyal to him, that she would take the witness stand and swear under oath that their love was real, providing him with the ultimate emotional alibi for his chaotic, destructive actions. He had absolutely no idea that his supposed loyal mistress had already shattered under the pressure, and that I was fully prepared to let him drag his very last remaining illusions straight into the open courtroom. The fallout from the collapsed mediation was swift and completely ruthless. When a man realizes he is cornered by federal banking laws, he sheds his liabilities to ensure his own survival. Roman immediately cut all ties with the outside world, barricading himself behind his frantic defense attorney. In doing so, he made his final, fatal miscalculation. He abandoned the woman he had hired to play my replacement. Celeste Wynne was a pragmatist. She had entered this arrangement expecting a lucrative property flip and a massive six-figure commission check. Instead, she found herself staring at the terrifying prospect of a grand jury subpoena and the permanent revocation of her real estate broker license. When Roman stopped returning her calls, the illusion of their shared enterprise shattered. Her resulting anger had absolutely nothing to do with morality, guilt, or sisterhood. It was the pure, unadulterated rage of a mercenary who realized she had been used as a disposable pawn and left to take the fall. The detonation occurred on a Thursday night at exactly 11:45. I was sitting in my dark home office, watching the rain lash against the window panes, when my cell phone vibrated across the heavy oak desk. The screen illuminated the dark room. It was a message from an unsaved number, but I recognized the digits immediately. It was Celeste. The text contained no apologies and no preamble. It was a single rigid sentence. "You should hear this before court." Beneath the text were a dozen compressed image files, screenshots of encrypted chat logs, and 3 distinct audio attachments. My pulse thrummed a slow, steady rhythm in my ears. I tapped the screen and opened the first voice note. The audio quality was slightly muffled, recorded from inside the cabin of a vehicle, but the voice was unmistakably my husband's. He sounded calm, authoritative, and entirely in control. "Listen closely," Roman's recorded voice instructed. "You need to pull the Pearl vehicle right into the center of the concrete. Angle it so she cannot park by the curb without getting out and walking past us. Be there at exactly 6:15. She gets home at 6:30 on the dot. When she pulls up, you step out. Do not look nervous. Smooth your dress, look confident, and wait for me to walk down the steps. When I get to the bottom, grab my hand. Make sure you are angled toward the brick house across the street. The widow has a doorbell camera. We need the footage to show a united front." I sat perfectly still in the darkness. My lungs felt entirely hollow. I tapped the second audio file. "The goal is a catastrophic emotional reaction," Roman continued, his tone shifting into a cold psychological assessment of his own wife. "She is tightly wound. If we blindside her right on her own property, she will snap. Let her scream. If she throws a fit, great. If she packs a bag and drives to a hotel, that is the jackpot. The absolute second she voluntarily abandons the property, I call the lawyers and file the separation papers citing an irretrievably broken marriage. I will have temporary control of the asset by Monday morning." I closed my eyes. The sheer depth of the manipulation was staggering. He had not merely anticipated my heartbreak, he had weaponized it as a legal strategy. I moved my finger and played the third and final recording. "You just have to play the part for a few more weeks," Roman reassured her, his voice dropping into a conspiratorial register. "Once the bank clears the final disbursement from the equity line, the commercial site is saved. I will push her off the title through the divorce settlement, and the house is ours to liquidate. You can move your things into the master bedroom as soon as the judge signs the order." The audio cut out, leaving a heavy, suffocating silence in my office. The affair was a ghost. The romance was a completely fabricated mirage. Every single agonizing second I had spent questioning my worth, wondering what she had that I lacked, had been entirely by design. It was a calculated, mechanical business transaction designed to steal my inheritance and save a failing construction company. Before the shock could fully settle into my bones, my laptop chimed with an incoming urgent email. It was from Lila Mercer. I opened the message. The subject line was blank, but the attachment was a scanned document bearing the official seal of the neighboring state's licensing board. Lila, working late into the night, had finally received the response to her deep background check on Arthur Vance, the notary public whose stamp graced the forged $250,000 loan document. Lila's accompanying message was brief and lethal. Arthur Vance was not in our city on October 14th. According to the certified continuing education logs mandated by his professional oversight committee, Mr. Vance was attending a mandatory 2-day ethical compliance seminar in a hotel conference center exactly 300 miles away from our home. He had swiped his electronic registration card at the seminar at 8 in the morning and again at 4 in the afternoon on the exact day he supposedly witnessed me sign my home away. The notary stamp was physically impossible. It was a complete fabrication, likely executed by Roman using a stolen or duplicated seal. The entire landscape of the battle shifted violently in that single moment. This was no longer an ugly, contested family law dispute over a bitter divorce and hidden marital assets. It had officially crossed the absolute threshold into a massive, multi-layered criminal conspiracy. Roman had orchestrated a staged affair, engaged in premeditated emotional abuse, committed federal wire fraud, forged a legal financial instrument, and falsified an official state notary seal. By 10 o'clock the next morning, Roman's aggressive defense attorney realized his client was standing on a trapdoor with a rope around his neck. The opposing counsel knew that if we presented the voice notes and the notary alibi to a judge, Roman would not just lose the divorce, he would be indicted, prosecuted, and sent to federal prison for years. The desperation arrived in the form of a final, emergency settlement offer, delivered by courier directly to Lila's office. Lila called me to read the terms over the phone. Roman was offering an absolute unconditional surrender. He would legally assume 100% of the fraudulent debt, completely indemnifying me from the bank's claims. He would sign a quitclaim deed, permanently relinquishing any and all future rights to my mother's house. Furthermore, he offered a staggering cash settlement of $250,000, pulled from the absolute last remaining liquid assets of his collapsing company, payable within 14 days. It was a fortune. It was the kind of massive, clean break offer that any rational outsider, any colleague, or even Tessa, would beg me to take. It was a golden parachute designed to make the nightmare end instantly. It was enough money to completely repair the house, take a year off work, and rebuild my life in absolute peace. All I had to do was sign a strict non-disclosure agreement, seal the court records, and allow Roman to walk away with a clean, legally sanitized narrative. He wanted to buy his way out of the consequences. He wanted to pay me to pretend that the marriage simply ended because we fell out of love. I listened to Lila read the final clause of the settlement. I looked out the window of my office at the Crown Harbor Infrastructure Authority, watching the gray clouds roll over the city skyline. I thought about the pearl vehicle blocking my path. I thought about the confident, condescending text messages. I thought about the voice notes plotting my emotional destruction. "Vivian," Lila said quietly over the line, her professional detachment slipping just a fraction. "Legally and financially, this is an incredible victory. You get the house free and clear, and $250,000 in damages without stepping foot inside a courtroom. It is a very safe exit." I took a slow, deep breath. The air in my lungs felt remarkably clear. "No," I replied, my voice carrying the absolute, unyielding density of solid iron. "Reject the offer." Lila paused for a long moment, but she did not argue. "Are you entirely sure if we proceed, everything becomes public record? It will be a bloodbath for him." "That is exactly the point," I said, leaning forward in my chair. "This was never just about keeping the house or getting a payout. He built a fraudulent narrative to humiliate me and steal my life. If I take the money and sign the non-disclosure agreement, he gets to walk away and tell his future investors and his family that it was just a messy divorce that he settled generously. He gets to keep his clean image." I looked down at the encrypted hard drive resting on my desk, containing the undeniable proof of his complete moral and legal bankruptcy. "I do not want his money," I stated, the finality of my decision ringing clearly over the phone. "I want the truth. I want every single forged document, every staged photograph, and every deceitful voice note officially entered into the permanent court record. I want his actions legally documented so that he can never, ever lie about what he did to me." "Set the court date." Lila. "We are going to trial." The heavy oak doors of courtroom number 412 swung shut, sealing us inside the high-ceilinged, windowless chamber. The air was thick with the scent of lemon floor wax and old paper. The presiding official, Judge Caldwell, was a man who had spent 3 decades on the bench and possessed zero tolerance for theatrics. When the bailiff called the session to order at exactly 9 o'clock in the morning, the final battle for my life officially began. Roman was called to the witness stand first. He walked up the wooden steps, wearing a charcoal gray suit, his posture perfectly straight, his expression arranged into a mask of weary, reluctant honesty. He placed his right hand on the Bible, swore to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, and then sat down to commit absolute perjury. Under the gentle, guiding questions of his own defense attorney, Roman wove his final masterpiece. He testified under oath that our marriage had been functionally dead for over 2 years. He claimed we lived entirely separate lives under the same roof. When asked about the massive home equity line of credit, he looked directly at the judge and stated, without a single tremor in his voice, that I was fully aware of the loan. He claimed I managed the household finances and had happily agreed to leverage the property to help him through a tough business quarter. Finally, his lawyer brought up the incident in the driveway. Roman shook his head, offering a sad, patronizing sigh. He testified that the woman was just a business associate, that he had merely offered her a ride home, and that the entire confrontation was an unfortunate, profoundly misunderstood meeting blown out of proportion by a spouse who was looking for an excuse to ruin him. He was so convincing, so smooth, that for a split second, a stranger walking into the courtroom might have actually felt sorry for him. He firmly believed his performance was bulletproof. Then, it was Lila Mercer's turn to cross-examine. Lila did not shout. She did not pace the floor or point fingers. She approached the podium with the quiet, lethal grace of a predator that had already cornered its meal. She did not ask Roman how he felt. She asked him to read, one by one. Lila entered our exhibits into the official court record. She handed the bailiff my municipal security badge data, proving I was trapped inside a state building nearly 100 miles away on the exact day and hour the loan was electronically signed. She entered the printed email Roman had sent to his sister 14 months prior, the one where he explicitly admitted he knew the house was entirely my separate property, and that he needed to manipulate the paperwork to touch a single dime of it. She entered the internal corporate ledger provided by Derek Sloan, highlighting the exact thousands of dollars funneled from my forged loan directly into Roman's failing commercial project. Roman squirmed in the wooden witness chair. The arrogant ease completely vanished from his shoulders. He tried to backtrack, stammering about shared passwords and misunderstandings in family emails. But Judge Caldwell was already leaning over the bench, his jaw set like granite as he reviewed the undeniably contradictory timelines. Still, Roman clung to his final lifeline. He looked desperately toward the heavy courtroom doors, banking his entire freedom on the belief that nobody could actually prove the driveway incident was a premeditated setup. He believed his word would always be stronger than mine regarding that single, humiliating night. Then, the heavy oak doors opened. Celeste Wynne walked down the center aisle. She had been served a binding judicial subpoena by Lila the previous afternoon. She was not wearing an emerald silk dress today. She wore a severe black blazer, her face entirely devoid of makeup, her eyes hard and hollow. Roman's face drained of all color. The last pillar of his defense began to crumble the moment she raised her right hand to take the oath. Lila called her to the stand immediately after Roman was dismissed. Lila did not waste time with background questions. She connected a portable digital speaker to the courtroom audio system, submitted the verified digital files into evidence, and pressed play. Roman's own voice suddenly echoed through the silent, cavernous courtroom. The judge listened to the audio recording of Roman explicitly instructing Celeste to park the Pearl vehicle in my driveway. The courtroom listened as Roman coldly calculated my exact arrival time from work. They listened as he mapped out his plan to trigger a catastrophic emotional reaction, instructing his hired mistress to hold his hand in front of the neighbor's security camera to create a false narrative of separation. And finally, they listened to his voice promising Celeste a massive real estate commission, assuring her that he would force me out and that the house would belong to him entirely within a matter of weeks. The silence that followed the audio playback was suffocating. Judge Caldwell slowly took off his reading glasses and stared at Roman, who was now gripping the edge of the defense table so hard his knuckles were entirely white. "Ms. Wynne," Lila said softly, standing at the podium, "did Roman Hale hire you to stage a romantic affair for the express purpose of fraudulently driving his wife out of her solely owned property?" Celeste did not even look at Roman. She stared straight ahead and spoke into the microphone. "Yes. He told me the marriage was just paperwork, and that if I helped him create a public incident, he would guarantee me the listing when he forced the sale of the house. It was a total, unmitigated slaughter." "But Lila, A woman who never left a job unfinished, delivered the final, fatal execution. She approached the bench and handed the judge the certified attendance records from the state licensing board. It was the absolute proof that Arthur Vance, the notary public whose official seal was stamped on the $250,000 loan document, was sitting in an ethics seminar 300 miles away on the day of the signing. "Your Honor," Lila stated clearly, ensuring the court reporter caught every single syllable. "The plaintiff submits that the respondent has not only committed rampant perjury in this courtroom today, but has engaged in premeditated wire fraud, identity theft, and the forgery of a state official's seal to maliciously strip the equity from a separate premarital asset." Roman's defense attorney slowly closed his legal pad, laid his pen down, and pushed his chair back slightly. He was legally and ethically withdrawing his support in real time. Roman Hale was entirely alone. Judge Caldwell did not even recess to his chambers to deliberate. He delivered his ruling directly from the bench, his voice echoing with absolute authority. He struck down every single one of Roman's claims. He granted me immediate, exclusive use, possession, and control of the residential property. He approved our claim for the full reimbursement of every single dollar of dissipated marital assets, attaching a heavy lien directly against Roman's remaining corporate shares. Then, the judge turned his attention to the forged loan document. He stated for the official record that the court found overwhelming, indisputable evidence of financial fraud. He formally announced that he was referring the entire matter, along with the unsealed audio recordings and the forged notary logs, directly to the State Attorney General and the Federal Banking Commission for immediate criminal investigation. The gavel fell. The sound was like a gunshot in the quiet room. The war was over. I watched Roman stand up from the defense table. He looked entirely hollowed out, a ghost of the man who had stood on my front porch in a tailored suit just a few months ago. He had walked into this marriage demanding control, and he was walking out with absolutely nothing. He had no house. He had no perfectly crafted narrative of a tragic separation. He had no loyal mistress waiting for him. He had completely destroyed his own polished, gentlemanly image, trading his entire life for a federal criminal record. He did not look back at me as he walked out the heavy oak doors. 3 weeks later, on a crisp Saturday morning, the air smelled of damp earth and blooming dogwood trees. I stood at the very edge of my property, wearing an old pair of denim jeans and a faded gray sweatshirt. I held a cordless drill in my hand. I carefully removed the tarnished brass house numbers from the wooden mailbox post and replaced them with heavy, modern, matte black ones. I walked up the driveway, carrying a heavy bucket of industrial concrete sealant, and slowly, meticulously, patched the hairline fracture running down the center of the asphalt. I smoothed the gray paste until it was perfectly flush with the surface. When I was finished, I wiped the dust from my hands, walked over to my sedan parked by the curb, and got behind the wheel. I turned the ignition, put the car in drive, and pulled forward. I did not park on the street. I did not park to the side. I steered the car directly into the exact center of the freshly sealed concrete. I turned off the engine and stepped out into the bright sunlight. I looked at the house, the deep blue shutters, the white trim, the heavy oak front door. The porch light was off. The yard was quiet. There were no strange vehicles blocking my path, and there were no ghosts lingering in the shadows. For the first time in an incredibly long time, the driveway, the house, and the life inside it belonged entirely and exclusively to the only person who had never, ever abandoned it. Thank you so much to all the listeners for staying with me until the very end of this journey. I would love to know where you are tuning in from today. So please leave a comment down below with your city or country so we can interact and share our thoughts on Vivian's incredible fight for justice. If you enjoyed this story, please make sure to subscribe to the Violet Revenge Stories channel. Hit the like button on this video and show your support by pressing the hype button so that this story can be heard by even more people who might need a reminder of their own strength.